Are about to resume, and I see my counsel is coughing. Counsel Mr. Swan. He is going to be speaking to you next. And in terms of the procedure for this afternoon, we're going to ask Pastor Whaley, yes, he's going to be asking some questions first. And thereafter, commissioners will ask some questions. So, Mr. Swan, I believe you wish to speak to the witnesses.
Yes.
And I think you have some cross-examination.
I do have some questions, just for clarity points. So first things, Ms. Winfield and Mr. Riley, did you submit your resumes?
Yes, we did.
Or
Bios, not resumes.
bios? Yeah, sorry, my apologies. Your bios. Do you have them to hand to be able to give us a bit of background on both of yourselves?
No.
We
We sent them in.
Okay.
Yeah.
I have a copy, so I'll give them to you. If you can
Thank you.
give us some of your background, that would be very helpful.
Perhaps what you could do, Mr. Swan, in order to expedite matters, just take them through it. Say, were you so-and-so, and were you so-and-so? Just ask the questions and have them
Okay.
acknowledged.
Do we have another copy? Ms. Winfield first?
We'll do Mrs. Winfield first.
Yes. Okay, just to allow Ms. Winfield, we have up your bio. So you can confirm for us that you are in fact a graduate of Queen's University,
Correct.
and you have a certificate in social justice
Yes, that's
and diversity.
from University of Colorado, graduate certification.
Great. And in terms of restorative justice and restorative practices, you're a licensed trainer.
Yes, I am.
Yes. Okay. And in December 2013, you did a research paper on the presence of white privilege in Bermuda.
That's correct.
And in 2017, you helped CURB launch the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Community Conversation.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ms. Winfield. And Mr. Riley?
Yes.
Your post with the Bermuda College is that you're currently the International Researcher and Planning Coordinator?
Institutional research and planning
Sorry,
coordinator.
institutional, yes. And you are also the Managing Director of Profiles of Bermuda?
That is correct.
And previously, prior to your recent post with Bermuda College, you were a government statistician?
That is correct.
And you have produced numerous articles in terms of race relations and the education?
Yes. Many of them peer-reviewed.
Perfect. Okay. Great. And you hold a bachelor's degree in hotel management and a master's in tourism marketing?
That is correct.
And you have a post-secondary certificate in surveying?
Postgraduate certificate. Yes.
Postgraduate? Yes. Okay, well, thank you both for that. So I'm going to ask a few questions, mainly just looking to confirm some things that you had mentioned in your presentation.
If you could just clarify what type of survey for the avoidance of doubt.
Thank you, Commissioner Stubble.
Mr. Swan, for the member of the commissioner, it was survey sampling as in terms of statistics as opposed to land surveying.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Appreciate that. So the first question that I had was, why is Curb interested in this particular aspect of race relations in Bermuda and how they were depicted through the expropriation of Tucker's Town?
Well, if I may begin, going back to the big conversation in 2007 that was put on by the Bermuda government, attending those conversations were the Tuckerstown Historical Society. And they were telling the presenters, who were both from overseas, one black, one white, about the Tuckerstown experience and what happened in Tuckerstown. And they found the story rather fascinating. So on one particular day, they had a display of articles and things from Tuckerstown because a lot of people didn't know that particular story. I was the assistant project manager for the big conversation, and my job was to get things, to get them organized for the day. And one of the things that we did was to have a site visit to the grave, because for many Bermudians that would have been the first time, particularly since the golf course, the golf club was built over it, rendered it inaccessible to people during the day. And so I had to call the hotel, and they blocked it off for our time of visit. And we went down there to see it. I, of course, have known about the story. I have a relative who is actually buried in the grave. So I knew about the grave and had been there before. But for many Bermudians, it was not. But when they were telling their story, the Tuckerstown Historical Society, when they were telling their story, people, as I said, were hearing it for the very, very first time, and were very interested in learning more about it. This is just one aspect of the oppression that blacks face, the taking of the land, and so that is what really held our interest.
Ms. Winfield, anything you want to add?
Maybe just one thing from a personal experience. When I became very involved in race relations in Bermuda, back, I would say probably 15 to 20 years ago, I thought I was knowledgeable about the subject matter, but I had no idea how much the history became part of the work that we sort of started doing. And it was shocking to me. The more I discovered, the more I learned, the more I read in many of the books, how much of this was unknown. And basically, that led me to needing to start reading everything I could get my hands on about the subject matter. And I had not fully understood how the history is so much a part of what our life is today in Bermuda and how it resonates. And so it's very necessary to understand that context, to understand that history. If you're looking to move towards a place of reparation and reconciliation, you must understand what happened and how it came apart in order to learn from it, and in order to also to have empathy to find some way to find a resolution.
Thank you. The next question that I had, what historical... Wait, this one. What historical research did each of you particularly carry out to certify and verify what it is that you've presented to us today?
Do you mind if I start? This book, The Black History in Bermuda Timeline, is an accidental book. And the reason I say that is because when Cordell and I began to develop workshops that we began presenting around the island, specifically on race. We had to give examples. So it meant both of us starting to read a lot of the history books of the past. And I read things by William Zuhl, by Terry Tucker. I read work by Dr. Keto Swan, Walton Brown, Kenneth Robinson, Dr. Cyril Packwood, and so forth, including overseas writers who wrote, like Dr. Duncan McDowell. I've read his work. I've also read Dr. Thornton and Dr. Haywood, who wrote a book which includes a great deal of information about Bermuda, and Stephen High and Frank Manning. And also, I think it's Patricia Mudd who wrote the book on Portuguese in Bermuda, and also read a number of other books about racism and about the history of Bermuda in order to get as broad a cross-section and understanding of what went on. It became very apparent to me that the narratives were different depending on the race of the individual. Quite often, depending on the race of the individual, the narrative was different about the same subject matter. And so that led me to a curiosity to try to understand what is the difference between what tends to be the dominant narrative and the counter-narrative when we do tell our stories, or if you like, tell our history. And so we needed to understand that better. And so when you start explaining to people that, in fact, there are two sides to every story, and there's truth and validity in both, and that you may, both of you, live just 50 yards down the road from each other and have similar work experience and similar employment, your life experience itself is totally different, and more often than not, that is because of race, especially in the context of Bermuda. Did I completely answer your question? I may have gone on to something else, rather. Was there anything I missed?
No, just in general, we want to know what sort of research did you conduct? Was it first-hand research, or was it more so the continual reading of the text that brought you to the knowledge? So you would rely on those authors and those...
We relied predominantly on the authors. Remember, we both have jobs. We're volunteers. This is a volunteer organization. Neither one of us are paid for the work we do within CURB. So it was basically going to what was considered respected authors who fully cited their works. And so those are the kind of things that we examined. In some cases, we saw original documents or saw copies of original documents, but by and large, it's through the citation of other people's works. I think what happened is, as we began to put this work together, the timeline became more and more important to us when we were telling the narrative. And we suddenly realized that actually it's important to everybody to actually see this. And so that's when we began adding more and more to it as we came across various things in different books. So in a way, we've pulled the works of numerous authors together into one location.
Okay. That answers the question. Thank you. The next question that I had was...
Excuse me, did you want me to respond as well?
Oh, yes, please, yes. But all questions, well, I guess, will be to both, unless it's specific.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, most of the research that we have done is what is termed as desk research, so the reliance on the work that others have done, particularly with regards to Tuckerstown. You could do some primary research in terms of interviewing descendants, interviewing those who are living. I certainly recall having a conversation, for instance, with Bishop Chauncey Smith, who was living with Dinah Smith, who was one of the last descendants who were dragged out of Tuckerstown. So a lot of that research would have been, a lot of that potential is gone because most of the people who were living at that time, I certainly grew up in the Johnson's Bay area where the descendants had moved to. So I lived with a lot of these people. So I've heard the stories before. That's why I knew about the graveyard there, and I knew my own had family there myself. So I think in terms of gathering research, a lot of it has to be relied on. And part of the challenge is that when you go to go on published sources, there's very little of it, and then two, it determines who wrote those stories. So that is what sort of inspired CURB to do further research and to put together, as far as the beginning, a timeline so that people can at least see the dates and then go from there. So our work hasn't really finished, it's just begun.
And so I guess as a follow-up question from that, I guess you would say then that you've done some independent research into verifying what you've read, but not in any great detail due to the veracity of the authors who have put the works before you?
That's correct. And like I said, if you wanted to go into some more primary research, it would involve sort of ethnographic studies or something qualitative research, and that will be largely conducted on those persons who were there or their descendants. So that is something that can only be done now on the descendants and the gathering of what we call oral histories and things of that nature. That's very expensive work to do, and an organization like ourselves wouldn't be able to pull that off without any funding.
Can I just add one thing? We did put a call out to the public to send in their stories, and we did get a number of them send in their oral history, and we have supplied that to the Commission. Most of it is anonymously, but we do have a record ourselves of who supplied which story, so we can reference that if required. But it's very difficult. There's, we've mentioned before, the culture of silence and the culture of fear that has existed and to a degree still continues in this community around that past, and the fear of actually addressing some of those things. So we recognize that this is not verifiable material, but we do believe that the collection of these stories, the telling of these stories, is equally important because it's the only thing that we have left to remember those people, and their stories in and of themselves are important to our history.
So one part of your presentation that you went on to mention was that not until about 50 years after emancipation was there the first black MCP. Mm-hmm. Would, in your estimation, was that a norm across the British Empire, or was that something of an anomaly towards Bermuda?
I don't know if that was a norm, because I'm not certain of laws particularly being put in place at the emancipation to prevent that very thing from happening, or certainly to delay that happening. So I can't say for sure whether or not it was the norm.
Okay, so in terms of there being quote-unquote black MCPs or something to the equivalent in other British territories, was that something that you saw during that 50-year period, or was that something, again, not seen?
Well, if you look at the U.S. history and their emancipation, which was 1864, and they went through a Reconstruction period where there was access. We even know of Mr. Rainey, who was living in St. George's, went back to the U.S. and became part, I think he became a legislator, a representative, member of Congress. And he did go back, and there was a brief period when blacks in the United States were represented. But unfortunately, the rise of white supremacy and the retaliation around that occurred fairly rapidly, and you saw that dissipate very rapidly. Their history runs a little later than ours because their emancipation was later. There is equivalencies in some regards, I think you will find, but in other areas, not so.
And also you had, of course, the Jim Crow laws, which were very parallel to segregation here, voter suppression and all of those things. So there's some evidence of it taking place in other jurisdictions.
And if I could just add one comment, describing it as the norm, I think is not the right thing to say. Maybe it was what was done in many countries in some cases, but legislation has been passed historically in many countries to protect the landed gentry, to protect those with property, to protect those of a certain class. And it wasn't so much to protect the poor or the disenfranchised, and it was about power and control. So legislation in and of itself is not necessarily holy ground. There were problems with legislation, as is evidenced by the fact that it even allowed enslavement. So to label it norm is is it correct? I don't like to say it's correct at all, because in a way, there were many things wrong with the legislation. So it's problematic, I think.
And I don't know if it was mentioned. I think you went into a little bit of the detail of it. So you would say then, in terms of it being legislated in Bermuda, that may have been somewhat of a specific, or at least a one possible limited instance around the British Empire as to legislation that actually prevented or seemed to prevent black people from being able to serve in the legislature. Would you say that that was something of a limited, or at least a one-off maybe occurrence?
It points to it, but I cannot say definitively.
Okay. And in your research and understanding, when we looked at in Bermuda the number of persons who were sitting as MCPs and the adult population that was able to vote, and it being such a small percentage of the actual population, was that something that was seen across the empire in general, or was that something, again, that you would say Bermuda kind of delved down on, or was that something that Bermuda kind of did some specialized or different legislation from other territories?
Well, I mean, you have the example of South Africa, and that, of course, there came much later, and South Africa tried a number of things under apartheid in terms of creating a parliament for non-whites, all of those things, but not having real power. So this type of voter suppression, yes, we saw that in South Africa. I'm not sure in other colonies or former colonies if that was the same, but certainly I'm familiar with what happened in South Africa, and like I said, that came even much later, that total suppression. So it wasn't until 1994 when they had free and open elections in South Africa.
Just one comment. In our earlier history, quite a lot of Bermuda's legislation was copied by states in the U.S. because we were coming out with a legislation before other places. As we said, the 1626 legislation effectively making people of color, black people, chattel slavery. The 1623 legislation, which was the first piece of legislation in the British colonies, effectively directly addressing suppression of black ability to earn equity or property in any way. So we were almost, if you like, setting an example for other places to copy our legislation in those early days. So we haven't done the research into overseas territories in the same manner, but I'm sure there's some replication, but I also don't completely understand the relevance.
Well, what I was trying to ascertain is just whether or not this is something that we would have seen generally, or was this something that Bermuda sought to show more pressure on. So we were just trying to ascertain the importance of the oppressive means of the Bermuda government in terms of how it conducted its parliamentary process.
Well, I think what we saw when we looked at some of the quotes from Stephen Hye's book, he clearly states that we were one of the colonies, if not the colony, that was the exception, that we were very much focused on this kind of suppression, more so than the other places. I can't remember the exact quote, but he certainly talked to that, and he had obviously, because bases were built across the Caribbean, he obviously evaluated those other locations as well. So I think you can say that for sure that Bahamas and Bermuda, by the sounds of it, were the most radicalized around that kind of behavior. So I think we were not so much the norm, we were the worst of the worst, if you like. So maybe, we weren't we were certainly not at the bottom of the list. We were right up there with the oppression.
And following on from that, a similar line of questioning, in terms of what research you've done, would you say that there were other colonies where the minority, as you mentioned, being that white people were the minority in about 1920 or so, that they actually governed the majority? So was that something that would be seen across the British Empire? Or again, was this another oppressive point of Bermuda's regime?
Oh, yes. If you look at, was it David Osulaga's book, Black and British, there's numerous examples of the colonies. And in fact, it was so bad that because the laws in England, technically, slavery was not legal in England, but of course, people flew under the radar, and sort of some of the punishment for blacks was to be banished to the colonies, where they knew the life and the living was far harsher than in the UK. So they lumped together colonies. So the ones that had the plantations, like Jamaica, like Barbados, and the others. So yeah, the life was very, very harsh, and it was run by an oligarchy.
You also spoke about black people having to work in the back of the house of hotels, and the fact that during the time when, give or take around about 1920, when everything was happening with Tucker's Tone, that black people were, by virtue of acts of parliament, not able to work in the front of the house or in office management duties in hotels. So how was it that black people were initially, or at least around about the times of 1920, looking at tourism, and how would they have seen it as a benefit to themselves?
Well, I don't even think they were looking at it as a benefit. If you look at the history, you have the Furnace Withy Company, you have parliamentarians saying that, we want to create a resort in Bermuda. There is potential, because what was happening, we were in the agricultural business at the time, and these steamships were going out with agricultural goods, and then they were coming back with tourists, and they were staying for months to get away from the harsh winters. And that's when the idea started to click among businessmen that, wait a minute, we have an opportunity here. So I don't think the local population was even taken into consideration. It was, this is a business venture, and they went about doing it. So that the parliamentarians in bed with the Furnace Withy group, and they were able to get the legislation passed to have, I guess, the equivalent of a special development order to take away the land and to build this tourism resort. And so it created jobs, for sure. But initially it was the lower paying jobs, because you were not allowed to be in the front of the house. So being in the back of the house, being the maid, all of those sorts of things you can do. It wasn't until later that you were allowed to be in the front of the house. So I don't think the consideration for the people was really taken. I think it was, at least the evidence seems to suggest, that this was just a business deal.
I'd also like to just add, from a more recent perspective, we had a town hall meeting probably about 10 years ago, and I recall we asked people then to sort of step up and tell their stories, and a gentleman, elderly gentleman who had spent his whole life in the hotel industry, stepped up to the mic and stated that he recalled working at the Marriott Castle Harbour, and he said they had two cafeterias for staff. One was labeled staff cafeteria, and the other was labeled the help. The help were where black people ate their lunch, and the staff cafeteria were where the white staff ate their lunch. And the story he told has always stuck with me, because he said what happened, he was walking past the staff cafeteria and he saw a bowl of fruit, lovely, beautiful bowl of fresh fruit. The fruit that was on display in the other cafeteria was very much old fruit. And so he said he stepped into that cafeteria and took a banana out of the bowl of fruit and stepped out again. and then basically said for the next 2 or 3 months he lived in fear that at any point he was going to be dismissed because somebody told that he'd gone into the staff cafeteria and taken a banana that was fresh instead of what they were being given in the other cafeteria. So this is not ancient history by any means, and these kind of things were going on. And the other thing I'd like to add, that in the book, one of the books by Ira Phillips, he talks about the Belko Riots, and there's a whole article about what happened during the Belko Riots. But what many people don't realize, 9 years after so-called desegregation in 1959, that they still had separate bathrooms at the Bermuda Electric Light Company, that they still had separate areas where people could eat. And this was part and parcel of the reason that the riots occurred, that there was still that kind of thing going on in companies 10 years after so-called desegregation.
So, in your recollection or your understanding from what you've read, how did black people in Bermuda, or how were the lower class black Bermudians considered, or how would they have felt their part to play in the tourism product of Bermuda would have been?
Well, Bermudians tend to be friendly, and so a tourism industry is an industry where you have to be friendly. It was also employment. It's an industry that's highly labor intensive. There's an industry that you don't need a great deal of education because coming along, many black Bermudians would not have gone to high school. Many would have left primary school to work so they can earn money to help with the family. And so this is an industry that they can work in without having to have a whole lot of education. So that is how they were able to assimilate into the industry. They were very friendly. And the hours that they work, you'll find that certainly when tourism really took off, that you could earn a decent living in the later years. But in terms of initially, it was seen as an opportunity to work where you didn't require a whole lot of education.
And in terms of mentioning, you said around about the 1950s, mid-1950s, the amount of the adult population that could vote was about 7% of the adult population. Could you roughly, or are you aware of roughly what the makeup of the 7% of the population was?
Well, I know from the records it was between, depending on which record you look at, it's between 45 and about 50,000 people. If you estimate that the adult population would have been, say, 35,000, but for round numbers, 30,000, you take 7% of that, you're talking about 2,100, I think it is, something like that,
Yeah.
2,100. So a very small minority of the adult population, obviously.
And also, you had the situation where many who were landowners could vote multiple times. So you were allowed to own property in every parish. You had 3 days in which to vote, and you would get on your horse and buggy, and you would drive between the parishes, and you would vote in every single parish. So in fact, you had multiple votes.
And in your research, would that have been primarily white men at that time, or what would have been the racial, I guess, makeup, I should say?
Oh, mostly.
Of that.
If I have to guesstimate, it'll probably been about 90% white males. Remember, at that time, women were not allowed to vote, whether they're black or white. And then you're only talking about blacks who had owned land. So if you look at Parliament, when we talked about William Joel being able to represent in 1883, it was almost 50 years afterwards, just to get elected. So you had to amass property. And I think that was probably the drive, because we hear a lot today about Bermudians being land-rich rich but cash poor. Well, part of that could have been, and I'm making an assumption here, that's not fact, that the drive was to earn land so that they could vote, and that was a way of emancipation. Yeah, it would have been predominantly white males at that time.
Could I say one more thing?
Yes.
As you touched on the women's vote in there, that happened in 1944, considerably after other jurisdictions, especially the UK. And that reason for that delay was because the fear was if you gave the vote to women, you would have to then give it to the black population. But it was still delayed considerably, even though the vote for women came in 1944. And I can just read something from the Black History Timeline. It says, following the passage of the bill, Mr. David Tucker, a lawyer and editor of the Bermuda Recorder newspaper, said in an editorial, less than 300 ladies were powerful enough to alter our franchise to introduce women's voting. Surely 20,000 people, if united, should be able to bring about universal suffrage and thereby giving every adult in the colony an opportunity to have a voice in the affairs of government. But that took to 1968 to, in effect, at least get somewhat universal, if not complete, suffrage. So there were delaying tactics. That's why women were delayed much longer than in other jurisdictions, because of the fear that they then would have to give it to the black vote.
And following on from that question, knowing that roughly about 7% of the population could 7% of the population could vote in terms of general elections and the like, what or how would that have played out in what we saw in Tucker's Town and eventually St. David's in terms of what was done and how it was done, and most notably to the detriment of black Bermuda?
Well, there would have been no opposition. Here you have a small group, a very powerful group, and you have a powerless majority. And so you can pass the laws, you can do whatever. What recourse would one would have had if one didn't go against it? The story of Dinah Smith, which I'm sure has been mentioned previously, she fought to the end, but she had no recourse. What can you do if you have no recourse? And that was a challenge. If those who are making the laws, those who are protecting you, are the very ones who are helping to take away your land, where do you go to? It's sort of like, in the states in the South. You have no recourse, and that was a challenge that they had.
I guess an example of that would be Reverend Charles Vinton Monk, who was held for libel for trying to stand up for the West Indian people who were living in Dockyard at that time, working on new buildings in the Dockyard area. And they were brought in specifically to work on that, coming up from, many of them, from working on the Suez Canal. And they were brought here to meet really unacceptable conditions of living conditions. They were promised housing and all sorts of things, but they were put up in tents. There were women included in that and children, and very limited access to bathroom facilities and all those sort of things. And there were riots that occurred, and a couple of people died during those riots in 1900. And so he stood up for them and wrote in a newsletter, a sort of small newspaper he produced, talking about the injustices that were happening. And he was held for libel by a company called C.H. Walker that had been hired by the British Navy to do the work at Dockyard. And he was imprisoned for 6 months. And he noted that the barristers and the lawyers were all related to each other, the prosecution and that sort of thing. So you had this sort of incestuous relationships within the legal system even, where it was such a small minority that controlled the country that they were the ones who were the barristers, they were the judges, they were the attorney general, and so on and so forth. And it created a very problematic environment, but it was never discussed. It was the way it was. He was held for libel. He was found guilty and imprisoned for 6 months, and he was only last year pardoned by the governor of Bermuda because of the injustice that was done to him. So it was that limited number of people and the control and power they had across numerous different sort of aspects of the environment of the colony at the time.
Okay, and then if we move on again, back to tourism again, and how it ultimately affected Bermuda. So would you agree that, in general, the sentiment that has been mentioned, at least previously by another expert that gave evidence, that in general Bermuda wholly benefited by the move towards tourism? Would you agree with that sentiment, or what would you say in regards to that particular sentiment?
Well, if you look at the economic data, it's hard to make a case against that because the economy grew under tourism. It provided a level of work for residents, but that came at a price. And I think if you talk to particularly the descendants of Tucker's Town, particularly those whose families didn't want to sell, Dinah Smith is the one that we know about held out to the end. Others saw the handwriting on the wall and decided that they are just going to, you can't fight government, you can't, they don't have the power. Just go and move on. And, so you had that sentiment. But yes, the evidence will suggest that tourism did grow. But again, if you were part of the families who had your land taken, and now you see what has become of that land, and you never wanted to sell, and you didn't feel that you got the fair price for it, there is that issue to deal with. I mean, that's what causes friction. That's why we have challenges even today, because that plays out in terms of race. The white man came down there and took away my land and made millions off it, and my family were almost destitute. So that bitterness is still going to be there until it's really dealt with.
I'd also like to mention that in the materials that were provided the Commission with is a statement from a St. David Islander who is the daughter of family members that were taken out of St. David Island, that had to move into barracks for a number of years. And she tells the story of listening to countless stories from her mother as a child growing up, and how that, in fact, part of her family came from Tuckerstown and were forced to leave the area and actually ended up in St. David's Island, only to find themselves turned out of their homes in St. David's Island 20 years later. And she talks to the fact that the elders would often say that they did not get the full value for their property, that was what they shared and what they discussed. And that's how she finishes her statement, talking about that they did not get a fair deal. And I'm sure that the same thing occurred during Tuckerstown, and I think if the right research is done, this can probably be shown. And I also believe that to think that they weren't shortchanged is perhaps being somewhat naive, considering it was segregation, full-blown segregation during that era, and that when you're a businessman, you're trying to get the best deal you can, and that land was purchased and then turned around and sold to very wealthy white Americans to build these enormous houses. And you can be sure that if you then look at the sale of the land, that you can see the enormous disparities between what was paid for it and what it was sold for. Now, fair enough, infrastructure had to be put into place, but I am sure that there was substantial profit made over the sale of that land. And so I think it brings you back again to the fact that the same thing occurred in St. David's Island, and those whites that did own land in St. David's Island were looking to benefit from the tourist trade by this time. They recognized they had waterfront property and so on and so forth. So it was about the deal. It was about profit. It was about power and control. So we have to just realize the context of this piece of history, and to realize that Bermuda was very much, in that regards, a very radical colony, and it was run by a very very, very few people. And the immigration and the way it was done, I believe Dr. Francis in his presentation also talked to that, that immigration played a vital part in that, because how immigration was done and who could vote and who could not vote basically ensured that that parliament ran a certain way with the power amongst certain people for considerable length of time.
I just want to draw, if I will, Ken, a parallel even today in terms of dealing with the pandemic. There is a mentality out there that, just let the virus spread throughout the community, and those who get it, some will die off, but the rest of us could get on with our lives. The same back then, these few folks these folks have to sacrifice their land, so what, because the country is going to be better off for it, because we're going to have a tourism industry and we're going to be better off. So yeah, don't worry about those folk, they'll get over it. So I think, a parallel can be made there in the sense that still, what about those who actually had their land lost? What about those who have actually died from it? You just can't dismiss them. So I think that's the parallel I would like to make.
And Ms. Winfield, I know you just started to mention it, but I want to ask another question. So how did, in your research, how did immigration play a factor in situations that we see in Bermuda, such as Tucker's Ton and St. David's Act's appropriations?
Again, it was about who was in control, who could make the decisions. If immigration is controlled in such a way, the research paper I wrote is called, let me just go and double check what the title is. Bermuda's Immigration History, Race and the Quest for Votes. That's what it was about. Our immigration history was about who could control power and stay in power. And it was highly successful. If you think that emancipation was 1834 and the powers, the oligarchy stayed in power for decades and hundreds of years beyond that, it was because of that control of who was Bermudian, who was not Bermudian, and who got status, who did not get status, and the favoritism and that was directed at one group over another group. And it was all legislatively documented. So we know it was a systemic problem that went through our history for years and years. Even the moratorium that was placed on status in Bermuda in 1989, the reason it was placed on status in 1989 was because even though there had been, they had stopped that piece of the Commonwealth Act where non-Bermudians could vote after 3 years residency, they stopped that in 79, that status was still being given out, and it was shown to being given out on race. So the majority of people who got it nearly every year were white, and that did not reflect the demographics of this country. And a lot of people still think it's 60-40, but it's moved from that. It's now approximately just under 70%, 70-30 approximately. If you add in the expatriate population, you get to that figure. I believe it's closer to almost 50-50 when you add in the expatriate population. And when you look at our incarceration rates at 98% black, yet you've got a population, including expatriates, of virtually 50-50, you can see the injustice in what's going on.
And also to draw a parallel to your question, how does immigration impact on the land grab situation? Bermuda is a very tiny place. You had 10% of the land given up to American bases during the period of World War. Then you have land taken away from blacks to be given primarily to foreigners. So that is land that will probably never come back to Bermudians. So it didn't only impact that period, it's going to impact Bermuda for eternity, because that land taken by law and given and the people relocated elsewhere, that land doesn't come back to Bermudians, and that is why there's so much sentiment surrounding that because of what has happened. So that is how immigration policies impact. The land was taken, and it goes to non-Bermudians, and it doesn't come back.
Okay. And then I want to ask, in what you've described, you mentioned that race seems to play a key part in what it is that we say would be policies and things of the nature of Bermuda. So what I want to ask next is, in your estimation and in terms of what transpired, in your research, in what terms of what transpired in St. David's and Tuckerstown, would you say that race plays a key part in government policy in terms of what properties were expropriated, in terms of the communities that they affected most?
Well, we do know from research that Tuckerstown wasn't the only property that was under investigation. I believe other properties, perhaps I think even Spanish Point area would have been one. There may have been a spot in Southampton that was looked at. But for whatever reason, I'm not sure why the reason, but whatever reason, Tuckerstown was chosen. And we do know that based on the laws and the culture at that time, blacks would not have been considered persons who they needed to consult. And so a decision was made. Folk leave there. We have laws, as we still do on the books today, where you can have a special development order. You can take them off the land and relocate them somewhere else and don't have to care. We do know that if that land, well, I won't say we do know, we make the assumption that if that land had been inhabited by mostly whites instead of mostly blacks, there perhaps would have been a different outcome. Perhaps they would not even been chosen. And so blacks tend to be looked at as lesser, as the other, and not having to deal with them like you would other folks. And we see that even playing out today, where blacks get treated one way and whites get treated another.
Okay, and then, so what I want to go to next was the recommendations that you had made in terms of what should happen in terms of what you feel would be the best remedies in the circumstance. Who do you say should who should implement them, and then secondly, how should they be paid for? Because I know a lot of them are financial in implication. So who do you say there's that finances should burden on?
Okay. I'm sometimes asked, and this is just, I think this is useful for the Commission to consider. I'm sometimes asked, why do I do the work I do? I'm not a born Bermudian. I may have been here 45 years, but I'm not a born Bermudian, and I didn't know anything about Bermuda history in any depth till 15 years ago. So why do I do the things I do today? It's because once I started reading that history, I recognized that when I came here in 1974, I applied for a job, and I got that job. I applied for several jobs. I actually was offered several jobs, and I got that job virtually immediately, the one I decided on in the end, and was thrilled that I got that position, and was very proud of myself. I thought I must have had the best resume and the best qualifications and all the rest of it. It turns out that I got that job. I was a shorthand typist. I was not some executive or somebody with extraordinary skill set in those years. And as such, anybody could have done that job. And there were many young women from Berkeley Institute, which was a black high school of excellence, that could easily have come in and done that job. But I realize now that when I look back on it, it was 1974. 71 was when we had desegregation of the primary schools. I know now that the way I sounded and the way I looked got me that job. So there is an accountability on my part. Am I directly related to the issues in Bermuda? No, I am not. but there is accountability to repair the harm. I have been offered privileges, opportunities, and access that I never would have received if I'd stayed in the United Kingdom working. I was offered those simply because I came as a white woman to Bermuda and sounded a certain way. So I would say there are multiple stakeholders at play in this that may not have a direct connection to specifically what happened, but there is a degree of responsibility. There is a degree of moral accountability because of certain advantages that it's given them. In fact, every single person employed, say, for instance, at Tucker's Point Club today, should be grateful and think about the price that had to be paid for their employment today. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it refers directly back to the actual people who did this. It is about the society in general saying there is an accountability. How are we going to best do this? So as far as who needs to pay or needs to fund, I think that's more for the Commission to consider if it gets to the point of what needs to happen following this Commission of Inquiry. But I think there is an accountability. I don't think just because you don't have that direct connection, you can miss out on that.
Yeah. I would say that some of the things that we had mentioned probably won't cost a tremendous amount, maybe a few $100,000. As a practical measure, and to be very direct in terms of making sure that those who benefited actually pay, you can even take a portion of the land tax that comes from that area and have a fund that they can utilize to carry out the very low-cost things that we have suggested in our report. The bigger issue is the aggrievement of the families who felt that they never got a fair price in the first place for their land. That's the big issue. And if the Commission then starts to look into that and determines that the going price at that time was not a fair price, then that becomes a much bigger issue. And that was probably something that be settled via the courts. So what we've suggested is first steps in order for first the history to be known, for the grave to be secure, for people to have access to it. Those are just the basics that any graveyard can expect. But the overarching issue is the settlement of, was this land actually paid a fair price for?
Justice, those are my questions. Oh, sorry, Justice, those are my questions.
Thank you. Now I'll call in Pastor Whalen to ask your questions.
Yes, thank you, Justice. Mr. Riley and Ms. Winfield, thank you for a very enlightened report this morning and for your sharing. My questions are particular to the cemetery and the church, Morrison Church. And I guess my first question would be with regards to a recognition of common ground. My notes reflect that in June 2007, myself as pastor, representatives of Morrison's, basically the trustees, Tuckerstown Historical Society, CURB, met with individuals of Tucker's Point, as it was called then, and dealt with the concerns with regards to the graveyard. So I wonder if you, I think, Brother Riley, you weren't at CURB at that time, but I'm wondering if you recall way back in 2007, and subsequently we were dealing with, we were had common ground. We were on the same page, meaning the church curbed Tuckerstown Historical Society with regards to the issue primarily about the desecration of the cemetery. So that's my first question. Do you recall that?
I actually have provided to the commission emails from that period of 2007, between, I think an email that I sent to you, and also letters that were sent to Tuckerstown, to Mark Orchard at Tuckers Point Club, a letter that we sent to him the 28th of May, 2007.
And you have his response in 2009, do you?
Let me just have a look. His response in 2009. Also, letters to the editor about Tuckerstown are in this package. Just, hold on. A letter I wrote myself on having gone to Tuckers Point Club. I wrote that letter May 24th, 2007. It's a letter to the editor describing the visit that we paid in 2007. And a meeting, yes, here I have meeting with Marsden Church officials at the boardroom of Ernst & Young, Friday, June 15th, 2007. And these are the minutes.
That was prior to, yes.
Yeah. Oh, it's prior to that? I have probably.
No, I mean, it was prior to our meeting with Tuckers Point.
Yeah. So.
And at the board. So I was
So
just.
I agree, yeah, there were meetings and we talked and discussed these matters for sure.
Right, so at that particular time, you would agree that we were kind of on the same
Yeah.
page.
I can actually see, we even have the action items minuted,
Right.
which was cover any open graves, carry
Well,
out.
number one would have been the question of
Yeah.
removing, at that particular time, the driving range.
Yeah, I haven't read this for a long time.
Yeah.
Redirect the driving range,
Right,
right
that
here.
was
Yeah,
number
so
one.
this is all in the paper. Would you like me to read them for your benefit, or are you okay?
I don't know if the commission. I
There's
think
about
they
10
have that.
recommendations that were minuted in 2007. Would you like to hear those?
Yes.
Yes? Okay. The recommendations that came out at that particular meeting were cover any open graves, carry out any other repairs to graves such as chipstone from golf balls, arrange to have all the graves whitewashed, repair the gate and reinstall, which must have been broken, I guess, at that time. Repair cracked commemorative plaque, draft an upkeep agreement, redirect driving range, which Pastor Whalen just mentioned, design and erect a covering of the whole graveyard, similar to the covering of the roadway to the Mid-Ocean Golf Club to prevent golf balls being hid into the graveyard and protect any visitors. That was an interim suggestion. Create a covered pathway to the graveyard, either from the club or from the road. Facilitate the graveyard being open to the general public. Undertake to research the gravesite, determine the full extent of the graves. Utilize Dr. Clarence Maxwell to bring on board the Bermuda Maritime Museum, which is what it was called at that time. In carrying out archaeological work and the use of specialized equipment for the above purpose, research the names of those persons who are possibly buried at the site, and also attached are records of deaths and burials, which was put together by Eugene Stovall and transcribed by Leonie Junis on the 23rd of August 2007, and there's a list of names there. So, yes.
Okay, yeah, I guess I just wanted to establish the fact, one, that Morrison was in a custodialship role with regards to the graveyard, that we were seeking to work collaboratively with Tuckerstown Historical Society and consented to their request that Kurt come alongside in that effort. That's my recollection. But I want to just move on. I don't want to take a lot of time. What happened afterwards was that we had a lot of frustration because Tucker's Point did not fulfill a number of those things, namely protecting the gravesite from golf balls or whatever. What occurred and with your report, you talked about the bulldozing of the cemetery. I believe that's how you described
Yes, it is.
that this morning. And so my question is, are you aware or were you aware that one of the recommendations from Dr. Harris as a result of the ground penetrating survey was that there were graves immediately outside the
Yes.
wall?
Yes.
And that the wall, that section was knocked down to extend to include those
Oh,
graves?
you mean the wall was knocked down?
Right, to be extended out to
Yeah.
include the graves. That's why
So, no, I haven't seen anything, any documents.
you weren't
around
aware
that.
of that.
I weren't aware of it. We weren't advised of that. We just saw part of the wall knocked down and the graves, well, you saw the picture, yeah. The picture of the graves and the wall in the distance knocked down.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to clarify that, because that gets a whole different interpretation, wouldn't you agree, to bulldozing the cemetery?
No, I don't think so. I think, maybe I shouldn't have used the word cemetery. Maybe I should have used the word graves. The wall, we're aware, was probably a 1940s addition, and was probably put because a number of the graves were probably by then no longer visible, and was put where they thought it was supposed to be. So the radar survey kind of verified what descendants had already said, which was that there were graves outside the wall. So when we saw that picture of the graves, we weren't so much focused on the wall or whether there was an intent to extend the wall around. We were focused on why would you bulldoze the graves.
Okay, I hadn't gotten to the graves. I was just dealing with the wall.
Okay,
Do
the
you
wall, no,
accept
we
the
knew
fact?
nothing, that there was a,
Right,
yeah.
okay,
yeah.
so you would accept the fact that it was, the intent was to extend it out to include the graves. That was part of Dr. Harris's
Well,
recommendation.
Presumably, yes. I accept the fact because you're saying it, Pastor, and also
Well,
because I'm
it's
sure
been
that...
documented.
Yeah. So if it's documented, then yes,
Right, yeah,
absolutely.
because we had subsequent meetings on
Yeah,
that.
I understand.
With regards to, you're aware that a number of members of the trustees who were currently at that time and now, and members of the church, have ancestry at the gravesite.
Yes,
right?
Oh, yes.
Right. So you would accept the fact that the church will not undertake to desecrate its own cemetery?
Presumably. I don't know. I haven't seen any documentation, but I am...
Okay, well,
take-
so,
Thank you.
but I can clarify that the recommendation was, and there's evidence in the ground penetrating
Okay.
survey, this is what we were going by. The aerial views from in the 1970, I believe 1973, compared to that of 1996 or whatever, showed that the sarcophagi, the grave tops, were added as a later addition. Now, you mentioned that you had some evidence documenting that those grave tops were part of the original
No.
site. Did
No,
you say that?
No.
No,
What,
okay.
what we said was that I have correspondence between myself and Peter Parker, who was in
Right,
charge of
right.
the
Bermuda
property.
Land
I have,
Development,
Yeah, I
right.
have correspondence and emails, and also telephone call with Peter Parker about the gravesite back then, and he clearly stated that when they went down there to examine what the state the gravesite was in, that there were trees growing out of the graves,
Right.
and there was many in disrepair, still there, but in various states of disrepair because of overgrowth, and that basically what they did, to just summarize it, was that they, the tops, if there had been tops and some, they were gone and broken, and so they took advice to just create cement tops. So when the report talks to sarcophagi, I think that's how you pronounce that word, I've never really said it out loud before, but when they replaced the sarcophagi, they were talking about the cement tops
Right.
were what replaced, but the actual walls of the little sort of freestanding walls that are maybe a foot or a foot and a half tall, those were the originals, which they repaired to
Right.
some extent, of those graves that were still visible.
Right.
But some were in a very sorry state of repair. So he actually verified these were the graves, these were the original graves. All we did was a bit of repair work on the new tops.
Okay. So finally, my last point
Yeah.
is you're aware that the church has been undertaking, as we were before, ongoing, trying to get on the same common ground and working with all stakeholders to try to bring some resolution and healing with regards to the cemetery. You are aware of that, right?
I haven't seen anything recently, but I know there has been a division between.
Well, you're aware of the former ombudsman, Arlene Brock, her effort to
Yeah.
arbitrate with Dr. Ferguson and Glenn Fubler, right? I don't know if you were at that meeting.
No,
No, okay, well, someone, I believe, from CURB was represented, as were
can't remember.
other stakeholders.
yeah,
And there have been other
attempts.
attempts to
Okay.
try to bring a resolution with regards to recommendations you were making. Okay, thank you.
So those are ongoing, those meetings, Reverend?
Yes,
Okay,
yes, yes.
thank you.
Thank you, Justice.
Pastor. I'm going to call on commissioners to ask your questions. But please, you don't have to turn around to look at the commissioners because of how you're positioned.
Okay,
Okay.
Just, I'm sure electronics will bring the questions to you.
Okay.
And you can keep your position and answer, please.
okay.
Thank
The
you.
first person that will speak is Mrs. Fort. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Winfield.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Wiley.
Good
Good afternoon.
I'm coming, my viewpoint, I'm coming from a point of view of, sorry, I'll start again. Good afternoon, Mrs. Winfield and Mr. Riley.
Good afternoon.
I'm coming from a point of view of emotional attachment of property. In previous reports, I've learned that the community of Tuckerstown was self-sufficient. Today, I've learned that it was just not a community of homeowners and landowners who were able to produce food and fish for their families, but it was a community that was so self-sufficient that they had a school, they had a church, and they had a gravesite. So therefore, to me, it had to be great emotional attachment for this community. Has your research shown that, or can you expand on that? The emotional attachment?
Yes. You had, I think, present yesterday, Mr. Duncan McDowell, I think his name is. When he stumbled upon the Tuckerstown story, he felt that it shouldn't be him to write the story, but a Bermudian, particularly maybe a black Bermudian. But he had a town hall meeting at the Marsden Methodist Church, and I was in attendance at that meeting. I don't know how many years ago it was. And people did talk about their attachment to the land, the community, that they didn't actually want to leave. That was where Bishop Chauncey Smith was in attendance. There were others who were in attendance. Some of them felt that moving to the area just east of Jones Bay perhaps was even, some felt that, a few felt it was better for them. They didn't feel that down in Tuckerstown, they had, they saw the handwriting on the wall, and they felt that, kind of resigned themselves to the fact that, well, maybe where we're going is better for us, that sort of thing. But there was always this view that there's attachment to the land, and I think Bishop Chauncey Smith, as he was telling the story of his aunt, Dinah Smith, being taken, kicking and screaming from the land really sort of cemented that attachment to that community, and perhaps it wasn't vocalized as such, but here you have that person who did not want to leave their property under any kind of circumstances being pulled away. And as I mentioned, I myself have a relative who was buried down in Tuckerstown. So they talked about, the times that they, the things that they used to do, all of the things that families used to do. The land becomes a part of you. And normally people talk about a homestead. They don't want to give up that homestead. They want to, it has, as you mentioned, emotional and sentimental value much beyond the value of the land itself. And to rip them from that is to rip their heart out. And that's basically what we understand happened to Dinah Smith, that she died because of that separation from her community.
So what do you feel was the real determining factor to disrupt and displace this thriving community? Why not, knowing that this community just didn't consist of homes and lands, but school, church, and gravesite, why did they not look at other parishes, like, for instance, that were maybe not as developed, like Warwick, for instance? Why was that not taken in consideration, or was it considered, and then the deciding factor was some other means as to other factors that led to the displacement of this community?
Yeah, part of this story, we don't have all the pieces, but we do know that they did look at other places. I believe Spanish Point would have been one, and I think some area in Southampton was also looked at. I'm not sure why they decided against those places, but the decision was made for Tuckerstown. And I believe that once the decision was made that this is going to be the place, then you simply make it happen. If people had to be moved, they had to be moved. If we have some legal obligation, we'll meet those legal obligations and we'll just move them. I don't think, in hindsight, there was any real thought, because they were black people and the way that black people were looked upon at that time, there were no consideration about the family ties, the community ties. History shows that when it comes to particularly black people, folk have no regard about uprooting us. We see even today being played out, separating families and putting children in cages and that sort of thing. When people are not the norm, when people are considered other, there are things that can be done to them, and people will simply say, well, and just dismiss it. And I think that was part of the underlying theme that was going on, that, they're not worth much anyway, so, we can move them out, and look what we will do. We'll have a thriving tourism industry as a result of that. So I think, in my heart of hearts, that's probably what was going on in their minds.
If I could just comment, you speak to the emotional toll, but we also understand that those people, that was their livelihoods you were also taking away. It wasn't just their land or their house. I don't want to use the word just. It was their land and their homes, or their homesteads, as many Bermudians still refer to their homes that way. But they lost their livelihoods. Many of them had gardens that produced fruit, gardens that produced vegetables that were sold to support the family. Not as many women worked in those days, and families were large. Yet still the husband, to a degree, could support that family, mainly because the women were doing all of these things to grow vegetables and fruit in their gardens. There were also substantial farms there that were taken away. So it's a case of livelihoods that were lost along with everything else that they lost, their homesteads and their, the emotional aspect of it. One's life was completely uprooted and changed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Riley and Ms. Winfield.
I have a few questions. Hopefully I don't get a rare card. With regard to the letter that you referenced in 1889, I believe, in the World Gazette, is there a body of information / records regarding life in Tuckerstown not connected with the Bermuda power structure? Prefacing that by, there's a common narrative about the sustainability of agriculture on the land and its fertility, the quality of the housing. There is a common narrative, negative, in that regard. That commentary kind of is almost 180 degrees different from the narrative you quite often hear.
Yeah.
It is apparent that that person doesn't have any stake in the game, if you will, and they appear to be independent.
This is, oh, I see, the person who was called A.O.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Are there any other persons who perhaps?
The reason that letter is in there is because I'm well aware of the narrative that appeared in the newspapers, the Royal Gazette, especially in those days, around this issue of Tuckerstown. And it was about that the land was not worth much, that the people were inbred. If you read those letters to the editor, there was even articles written later describing the people of Tuckerstown, and that they were not very clever, they were inbred, which is an implication in and of itself, that they were not intelligent, and so on and so forth. And that narrative was repeated again and again in the newspaper articles and letters to the editor in the Royal Gazette during this period. And as a consequence, that narrative took hold. But in fact, the letter from A.O., as he describes in 1889, is more likely to be the truth. I think when you're trying to buy land, you're trying to get it for the lowest price possible. So you're going to do everything you can to say the people are not important, the people don't know they're not intelligent, they don't know what's going on, and there's not many people there anyway, and this was the kind of narrative that you're referring to. And so it's okay, people, we can go ahead and do this because it's of no consequence. When in fact, this narrative from A.O. in the Royal Gazette in 1889 clearly describes an entirely different environment to what is described in 1920s in the press at that time. And we have to remember that the Royal Gazette at that time was started prior to emancipation, so it was owned by the oligarchy, and I'm not sure what the state is today, but the narrative is too around the Royal Gazette that it's always represented the interests of landowners and that sort of thing throughout its history. Perhaps not so much today, but it very much was the voice of the landowners and the gentry of the day. And their interests were in those people. Their interest was certainly not in black people, and you would not see a great deal of news about black people in the Royal Gazette for many, many years, from the start of their history until fairly recently and comparatively. So I think that narrative points out very clearly that there's we have to have more research. We have to really look into what was going on in Tuckerstown and what this extraordinary little community managed to achieve despite the huge barriers and oppression they experienced.
Yeah, I think it would be ideal to have that body of information, that body of research, but no, it doesn't exist. And most of the writers who have written a counter-narrative, they are relatively recent. And so the research to go back, like I said, doing some qualitative study among those who were alive then, that's almost past, since most of those individuals would have gone. so you can talk to their descendants. But it would be ideal to have talked to, and there are probably still some alive, so this could be part of the research, who can tell those stories. We don't have a whole lot of those stories, and the stories that we do have are not written by the people who are oppressed.
I have been told, and I've actually said this concern about what is available to do the research. And I have been told that there is material available, but it's in the hands of individuals. And from the black community perspective, they don't want to give it up because they recognize that there may be problems if they give it up, and that culture of fear and culture of silence. Also from the white community, there's a culture of fear and silence from the white community because they might look at the material that they have and feel that, oh my goodness, it might incriminate us. So there is a fear perspective embedded in all of this. And so it's how can we get to the truth and perhaps see some of those records, which I have a feeling are in people's attics, and I've been told are in people's attics. And so we need to access them. I remember MP Austin Thomas telling me years and years ago, I used to work with Austin Thomas when I first came to Bermuda, he telling me he had a whole pile of early newspapers from the recorder. And at the time, I didn't pay much attention to that, but I always remember him telling me that he had this source, but he had not handed it over to the archives. Again, because of mistrust of what would happen to that material if it was handed over. So how can we create an environment to say we need to know this truth, and whatever is handed over will be dealt with appropriately and properly, and it will not be covered up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Stovall. Thank you. Mr. Parent-Chief, Commissioner.
Hey, good afternoon,
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Curb, good friends of mine. I'm particularly intrigued by the extensive surveying that has been done on the Marsden grave site. And just a generic question, actually. I see that it was conducted around about August 30th, 2011. Dr. Harris was executive director of the National Museum of Bermuda and served as a project coordinator. Who actually funded it?
I believe, from memory, from reading the report, I believe it was funded by Tuckers Point Club.
Yes, I see the objectives were to investigate the existing cemetery for evidence of unmarked graves. And as a result of Rosewood, Tuckers Point needing to make planning decisions. But there seemed to have been some controversy at the end of. There were many unresolved questions, even after the GSR radar testing of the ground, or sonar testing of the ground, as to the location of other existing sites. But at the end of it, what really was the conclusive problem that still exists with that site? Even though I've read copious notes and heard various stories about it, and even the Reverend Whelan just now seemed to have a bit of ambiguity in some of the decisions that may have been made. What conclusively was decided after the survey team left, and what action was taken? I mean, I look here in your report, but you can
So, as you say, that survey was done in 2011. And I'm not familiar with, Curb was not really involved in any meetings around this following 2011. I guess we relaxed and thought, well, it's a historic protection site. It's going to be fine now. At least nothing's going to happen to it. We knew that, later the Ombudsman said it needed to be made a historic protected building to make sure that nothing actually happened to the graves. And there was a delay of 9 months between her report and, unfortunately, the graves being bulldozed. So there was intent to have those graves further protected, and it was stated. So what happened, I think it's conjecture, and that's why I think we need to ask directly. Marsden Church have been trying to resolve, from what the Reverend says, they've been trying to resolve the issue and to bring about some degree of healing. But actually, as to what happened and who made the decision, I'm unsure, because it's never really become public. So Dr. Triggs, in his report, actually states in various parts of his report, one or two times, he states that if these sites are not real, they could be removed. And they should, but before they're removed, they should be archaeological research. And he does at the end say that if they're removed, a dignified lawn should be put there. And I must admit, I thought to myself, I have a dignified lawn in my backyard. But I could, you put a memorial somewhere when you don't know where someone's buried, when you have the unnamed soldier, and that's when you put memorials, when you don't know where people are. We knew where they were buried. We know the radar survey verifies Tuckerstown descendants' narratives that the gravesite is actually bigger than what's depicted by the wall. And Reverend Marsden has now said that the reason part of the wall was knocked down was to include, maybe extend that wall around those few graves. But Dr. Triggs' report also talks to the fact that certain areas could not be evaluated because landfill had been put in place. So there were areas where we didn't know, it was not at that point possible to establish. We also know that the likelihood of the gravesite being substantially bigger than what it currently is depicted as is highly likely. This is the need for further research. We need to really look into that and have the ability to really do a really in-depth study of it. So those are the kind of questions that we have ourselves. I think the same things that you're struggling with is to who made the decision to say it's okay to knock these graves down.
Right, now, that speaks to a generic question of who has ownership of that gravesite. And looking at some of the historical records which indicate that the Methodist Church could not sell property, at least 1830, by an 1830 enactment. I know there was a subsequent act which did allow for sale of gravesite property, with the caveat that a certain number of the congregation and the elders of the church could make such a decision. However, I may be putting the question to the wrong persons, but who ultimately owns that gravesite? Has it been sold? And that's a generic question that must be resolved. Otherwise, any action, subsequent action surrounding, or decisions made surrounding that site will be superfluous. I mean, we just have to get to the generic point, who owns the gravesite?
I think, the Development Act, the Bermuda Development Company Act, had something in it that basically stated that the gravesite and certain other areas too were to be protected, were not to be, they were to be looked after and protected and recognized as, viable places and that sort of thing, as was the church, I believe, at the time. And the church then later on was sold, I believe.
Yes.
And so the church was sold. But the gravesite, I don't believe, was ever per se sold. It was sort of, it seemed to be this, I'm not sure if Reverend Wayland has the answer to that, and that's where the research needs to be. But it appears that a promise was made of some sort that it would be looked after and protected. But did that mean it was owned by Tucker's Point Club? I don't actually believe it was.
That is a question.
But that is something that has been, but I don't believe it was owned by Tucker's Point Club.
All right, thank you for
Yeah.
this
Do you
answers.
have anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. Starling.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Building on some lines of questioning from the council, QC and Junior, it occurs to me that there are two kind of key questions that the commission needs to consider in our deliberations. One of them is the concept of the rule of law, and another is the concept of theft.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the first.
The rule of law, the concept of the rule of law,
Thank
and
you.
the other one is a question of the concept of theft. And I will be asking you your thoughts on that to help me with my own thinking on it, but I hope my fellow commissioners will indulge me if I expand a little on that first. There are some that will seek to portray the concept of the rule of law as a settled and universalist concept. In reality, however, there are many definitions of the rule of law, and as a result, a key threshold question that the Commission needs to consider, in my opinion, is how the rule of law is defined. Slavery, for example, was illegal under certain definitions of the rule of law. For the scholars listening in and wondering if I'm talking nonsense, I will cite, for example, the Ditchian rule of law, named after the English jurist A.V. Dicey. I may be mispronouncing his last name. In other competing concepts of the rule of law, such as those that have more substantive concepts, such as adding fairness, see, for example, the position of John Rawls, or morality, see, for example, the position of Lon Fuller, or the concept of democratic ideals, see, for example, the position of Guillermo O'Donnell. Under those concepts of the rule of law, slavery and even segregation would constitute breaches of the rule of law, and thus rule of law was not in place in that context. Additionally, the law and even the laws of capital do not exist in a vacuum. There are aspects outside of strict procedural focus of law, that is the parliamentary law, that can bring into question whether the rule of law existed beyond the legal framework. There are extra parliamentary structures of power, such as race and sex, that we need to consider, for example. Then we come to the question of theft. We can look, for example, at Tuckerstown, that there was a commodity exchange. The landowners were given some money in exchange for their land. Can we say there was theft if there was a monetary exchange of commodities? On the surface of it, you could say no, there was a price paid. However, the question becomes one of whether the price was fair and if the exchange was equal. Did all parties have equal access to power to ensure a fair exchange? If there is great asymmetries in power, can we say the exchange was fair, or was it a form of theft even if there was money paid? So a key question I would put to the representatives of CURB, based on your personal research, is whether the rule of law was in place in 1920, or was the rule of law only established later, say, for example, in 1971, when segregation was ended formally, or even in March 2003, when we ended the racial gerrymandering, I think I can fairly say that, of our constituency system. Can we even say the rule of law has been established today when we, as a country, arguably, have not yet addressed historical violations of the rule of law, depending on your definition of the rule of law? Is there a need for atonement? Anyway, these are questions that I'm grappling with, and I would welcome the insight of the witnesses on that. Thank you.
I think in the context of 1920, or let's say now it's a great theoretical exercise. What is this rule of law? Because in the 1920s, you didn't have natural justice. So if there's no natural justice, how does the rule of law apply? It is established principle that a government of the day can make laws for the betterment of its people. So again, if we refer to the current pandemic, laws are being put in place where people's rights have been subjugated, but it is for the good of the people. And if people make or understand that I have to give up something for the good of us, then it may be worth it, even though I still am not happy with having to make a sacrifice. But with a special development order, a decision has been made that we need this. Then natural justice should kick in and say, is this in fact for the good of the people? Or is it for the good of some people? Because those who were making the laws stood to benefit from the laws they were making. That is otherwise known as corruption. So the rule of law, in my view, doesn't impact in this situation because we were dealing with corruption. And the people, and then there is an argument as to whether or not, again, is this for the good of the people? Yes, tourism did thrive after that, but Pakistan wasn't the only area. You had other hotel developments all over the island. So you can't say that Pakistan, if we didn't have Pakistan, if we didn't take the land from Pakistan, we wouldn't have had tourism. That is completely untrue. So that, I think those who made the law saw it as a business opportunity to sell to the wealthy and had the legal and legislative power to make it happen. And they did. But if, to me, is a lot closer to corruption than the rule of law.
I agree with everything that Carlyle just said. I think back to that 1889 letter by the gentleman A.O. and how he described the people of Pakistan as being friendly, industrious, intelligent people. And that if they had been given the opportunity, with tourism growing, maybe a little slower than if Pakistan had been built, but still growing, nevertheless, they would have eventually themselves made developments to build their own hotels and to build an environment that was conducive to the industry of tourism. Maybe not on such a grand and a wealthy extent as what was created by Furness Withy and the Bermuda Development Company, but I am sure the entrepreneur spirit of those people and the community that they managed to create would have also have benefited hugely and also have come up with solutions themselves to building tourism in their own environment. He actually talks about the hospitable nature of the people, the kindness and the friendliness of them. And as a consequence, they would have been ideally set to have set up their own industry themselves and possibly benefited from their own land. But this was, their right to this was denied. And I think I always tend to look at these things around justice as to fairness. What was fair at the time was clearly not what happened at that time. And I agree with what Cordell said. It's more to do with conflict of interest and corruption than it is to do with what benefited the community as a whole. It would have come, maybe not as quickly, but it would have come anyway.
And I'd just like to add, too, that you had hotels in the 1800s. I believe the Hamilton Princess and the former Hamiltonian, which was built on the site of City Hall, which was burnt down. I believe that was in the 1800s, but I'm not 100% sure if my memory serves me correctly. So you already had tourism taking place, and the modern tourism really didn't take off until 1930s, 1940s with the advent of commercial air travel. Up until then, it was all steamship, but tourism really didn't take off into the 1940s. So you could say that they were ahead of the curve, but it didn't really come until later. And still, if you talk about tourism development, if we didn't have, Pakistan wasn't taken, remember, Pakistan is the hotel there is a very small place. It's not a large, luxurious place with 600 bedrooms. It has less, I believe, than 100 rooms there. So it wasn't really ever earmarked for mass tourism. It was to be a small boutique type of place, but they're really, in my view, interested in the land and how they could sell the land, which is exactly what has happened. Good afternoon.
I only have one question. As land in Bermuda is premium because of its size, losing one's ancestral homestead, livelihood, and in the case of Tuckerstown, and perhaps losing the ability to properly transfer property of value, even if sentimental, for the benefit of future generations. Is there a direct correlation to the disparity in generational wealth because of that, and does that show up in your statistical data?
That's a tougher one. I think the first part of your question, is there a correlation? Yes. Because, well, we go back to our presentation, very little taxation, so all the wealth that you accumulated, you managed to keep and transfer. If you had, if you were a black person who was trying to get on the land ladder, and then of course your land was taken away, and you were given a price that you did not feel was correct, you wouldn't have had the opportunity. And where would you have been able to purchase something of similar nature? Because a lot of the research hasn't done. What were the land prices in other parts of the area? Were the land prices down there low? Were they high? I mean, all of those things have to be found out in order to really assess the situation. But yeah, if that land was taken away, and it was to increase in value over time because you had maybe 2 acres of land there and you're given half an acre somewhere else. But at the time they were comparable. But with the development there, that land was going to increase. Was that factored into the equation that yes, the land is worth X dollars now, but because of development it's going to be worth X much? Do you then put a value, do you factor that into it? I don't know. Those who deal in real estate will have to address that. But yes, that's the first part. I forgot the second part of your question.
Does this have a direct correlation to the disparity in generational wealth, which would also show up in your data?
Yeah, go ahead.
I believe it would. We do talk about, we saw the manifestations of the legacy in general of the blocking of access to being able to earn equity or property in any way. So if you had managed to buy a small piece of property, as say a white person would have been able to do, and you wanted to send your child to university, you could mortgage your house. You could send your child to university. You could begin to lift your family up through those kind of methodologies. But just like in the United States after the Second World War, when they introduced very low interest rate loans for ex-soldiers in the military in the US, it was denied to the majority of black people who served in the military. And as a consequence, they could not lift themselves up out of poverty following the Second World War. They weren't allowed to get these extremely low interest rates mortgages to purchase houses. And so obviously for them, that affected how they were going to be able to afford to send their children away to school later, generations down the line. Same thing happened in Bermuda with the denial and access to the opportunity. With regard to Tuckerstown, I agree with Cordell. I think we have to look at it as not just a monetary exchange, as a loss of livelihood. And a complete disruption to the way you live your life. All your life you've lived and fished, or all your life you've had ease of access to land around you of some substance, but now you're given something else with a house built on it, maybe much smaller. You can no longer grow the vegetables you used to sell in St. George's. So I think it has multiple knock-on effects beyond just the straight exchange of monetary value and whether the property was actually purchased for the right amount. Also, I think even in Duncan McDowell's research, he refers to the building of a Palm Beach of Bermuda. That was the goal. They wanted to create the equivalent of a Palm Beach of Bermuda for wealthy Americans predominantly. That was the goal of the company to create and to sell to wealthy Americans. So it was not so much the tourism industry itself, as far as the hotel, as Cordell says, was a part of it, but it was not as much as it could possibly have been. And then you look at the Tuckers Point SDO that was passed a number of years ago, the same thing applies here. Did what they say they were going to do with that SDO occur? Has that land been further developed? Or has it in fact now increased the value of Tuckers Point Club in effect if they were going to sell it on? So you wonder, when you pass these SDOs, do what they say what they're going to do with the property actually play out? You have no real concrete reassurance on that one. So predominantly, yes, it did create a lovely golf course, it did create a golf club, it did create a hotel. But does that compare to all the rest of the land that was basically sold off?
So that leads into if the land is not developed in accordance with the objectives of the companies, then that is land that is transferred out of the hands of potential generations of Bermudians in perpetuity, unless it's sold on the open market,
That's right.
which most people would not be able to afford.
And they also say, so much of this needs more research, but they also say that Dinah Smith never signed anything to pass on her land. That is sort of almost folklore on the island, and so many people have said it to me that one believes that is very likely to be true. But again, the research is everything.
To answer your question, does it show up in any statistical work? The answer is quite definitively no, because we have no way of measuring wealth in this country. Other countries have very robust collection things, whether it's through tax returns or mandated reporting by institutions. We have none of that, and so we only talk about income, but we have no information on wealth. When we introduced our racial justice platform in 2012, we had an item in there about collecting information on wealth. Of all the recommendations, and we may have it about a dozen or 15 of them there, if you look at the Royal Gazette at the time, that was the one that garnered the most opposition. Just the mere collection of data on wealth sparked so much opposition. And that would have been totally anonymous to the general public. It would have been perhaps in aggregate form. So we'd be able to measure things as they do in other countries, in other Western democracies, where they're able to tell. For instance, I think the last census in the United States showed that the wealth of blacks went from 1/10 of that to white to 1/20th in the last decade. But we don't have any of that kind of data, and so we're really operating in a vacuum.
Okay, but
Thank
you
you.
would, sorry, Justice, just let me finish off. So you would agree that the ability to transfer your property onto future generations does give them a head start?
Oh, absolutely.
And that doesn't need to actually be evident in any sort of statistical.
Oh, no. I remember having a conversation with my daughter one day. We were talking about this thing, and I said to her, what happens if you got all this money and all this property, and you can just pass it on, and there's very little taxation? And how do you think it will play out years from now? And she very easily said that, that their children will have it, and their children will have it, and that's how it goes. And unless you're able to somehow get on that ladder, there will always be this vast gulf between those who have and those who have not.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Milligan White?
Good afternoon, Ms. Whitfield and Mr. Riley.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
First of all, I'd like to really thank you for giving us such a thorough report on the environment in which the compulsory purchase took place. And I got the impression that the 23 family members were actually traumatized by the loss of their property, their way of life, and their culture to a large extent. Then you go on to tell us that we are two Bermudas. And that is the cause of many other issues and problems in Bermuda. I'm more interested at this point in finding solutions. And I would like to take a few moments of your time. Do you have some solutions to this problem? And by the way, before you answer that, I did a mini survey at my law firm when I was first appointed to the commission. And I asked the question, what is the most infamous loss of land in Bermuda? And there were about 10 people. And every one of them said Tuckerstown. So that's the base of a big problem that has created the two Bermudas. But I'm interested in your input into solutions, recommendations. Thank you.
Cordell just mentioned our racial justice platform, which is a living document, so we update it as things come to us, as things occur to us, as what needs to happen. It's a document that basically outlines a number of specific things that we feel, each in their own way, would go about helping to level that playing field. And it's about access and opportunities. A lot of people worry that, okay, the pendulum has swung that way for years, and the pendulum's sort of coming back down. Is the pendulum going to swing up this way? And the minority group on the island feel oppressed. No, it's not. It's not about that. It's about creating that level playing field, about creating access and opportunities without these barriers that continue to exist in our community. I'd rather have Cordell talk more about the racial justice platform in detail. And it's something we can certainly provide to the Commission. It's downloadable from our website. We have it on our website if you need to do that, along with a number of other resources. But as far as recommendations, we're also doing specifically the Truth and Reconciliation community conversations. We thought 5 years. We now see it as a 10-year project. We want to reach 1,000 people minimum. We feel it will create a paradigm shift. By sharing this kind of information, it's about how you create the empathy to say, now I get it. Now I have a greater understanding of why we have this two Bermudas, and now I want to work towards that thing that we all want, which is to live in a greater sense of community and have better relationships with each other. And I think to a degree it is attainable. You can never forgive completely what happened, but you can learn to find ways to repair the harm, and that's what we're seeking to do. How do we find ways to repair that harm and create the equality and equity that this community so desperately needs? So we will continue with those community conversations because we see it as about changing hearts and minds, and we actually see that happening in the process that we go through with people in groups. So I think as far as recommendations, a lot of people think conversation and talk doesn't amount to anything, but it amounts to the core change in humanity. When we really talk about these things, acknowledge the truth of what happened in the past, we can find ways forward to deal with it. But if we continue to sweep it under the carpet and pretend it happened, or to call it benign, or to continue to refer to it as, well, wasn't that the norm, or wasn't that what everybody did, you're not going to create the kind of community you're looking for. So, Cordell, would you like to add to that?
I think back in 2012, when I did my international diploma in restorative practices at Queen's University, the word reparation kept coming up. And at its basic form, reparations means to repair the harm that has been caused. And when we were going through our studies, one of the topics was historical injustices. And I decided to make that the focus of my final paper. But if you were to go through the literature, those familiar with writing academic papers, you have to do a literature review. Literature on historical injustices is very, very thin. There's very, very little of it in order for you to see, well, what has happened before. It seems almost as an area that no one wants to touch, because you've got to really pull the scab off that wound which you thought was healed. And so trying to figure out how do you repair the harm, it is almost without precedent. We do have some situations where the Germans have paid reparations to the Jews. We have the situation in Kenya. So there is some precedent for repairing those historical injustices. Part of the challenge with, say, for instance, South Africa, there was part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was reparations, that if you appeared before the commission, you will receive some sort of reparations. But the finances for that were not sufficient. And when we were there, was it in 2012 we were in South Africa? We were told by some that South Africa could go the way of other places. It could come out in a bloodbath because the pace of change was slow. And so in terms of what the solutions, that is how we arrived at our racial justice platform. And when we wrote that, we were really thinking of what the government could do. And so we had things like collecting data by wealth, like changing laws, all of those things. We weren't thinking of it from a holistic point of view. And that has given us great thought, because now that we've presented to a number of corporations, Bermuda, a number of exempt companies, when we do the very similar presentation that we've presented today, the response has almost unanimously been, what can we do to make Bermuda a better place? And that has caused, really flat-footed me, because we had not even considered them in the equation as to how to make Bermuda a better place. But yet they're coming to us and saying, what is that we must do? So I know that one of the things that CURB now has to focus on is a corporate plan in order to repair the harm that has gone before. And repairing the harm can come in various ways. We have tried to make links with the Commission on Reparations in the West Indies. We haven't linked up with them yet, but they did a radio program and we were able to ask some questions, and they suggested that we start a chapter here. And their view is not for individual reparations, but for more holistic reparations, where a fund will be set up and to assist those who have been the descendants of historical injustices. So those kinds of solutions are still very much being formulated. And if anyone says that, oh, we can't pay reparations, it's going to be too much money, or who gets it? Well, that is addressed by the fact that if you put it into some sort of escrow account and then have it managed. But if you look at what happened when the slave owners were compensated for their property in 1834, that 20 million pounds. It took 187 years to pay that back. So that puts paid to any concerns about it's too much money. That wasn't considered when you're paying the slave owners. It took them, as I said, 187 years. So if you're serious, or if people are serious about repairing the harm, some of us don't mind waiting 187 years because our descendants will be able to recoup. But that is the level of thought that has to be taken in order to bring about proper solutions to this situation.
I could give just one very brief example. I remember when, for a short period of time, we had free education at Bermuda College. And that free education did cost the country something. But you have to stop and think, who attends the Bermuda College? And it is by and far black people, descendants of enslaved people on the island who attend Bermuda College. About 10% white, maybe? Probably around 10% white. So by making Bermuda College free, you are lifting up a group of people that have traditionally been disenfranchised. And you're also lifting up those poorer people who perhaps can't afford to go away to school, whether they're white or other or whatever you want to call them. So it was a policy that was helping to repair the harm and was allowing people that perhaps otherwise would never have the possibility of attending college, even when it was very low cost. I think it was like $3,000 or $4,000 years ago, a few years ago. But so these are the kind of things that can happen, and they are forms of reparation. Reparation comes in many, many different forms, and even from the free bus for senior citizens. Who catches the bus? The majority of people who catch the bus are black. And many of our seniors were denied working in environments that gave them good wages, and so they still catch the bus because that's what they've done all their lives. So again, different ways of reparation.
Thank you, Mrs. Winfield and Mr. Riley, for spending the day with us and for your presentation. Thank you. And let me thank everyone who has been present and contributing and participating. Now, we will adjourn until Monday, the 26th, when we resume at 10 a.m. in the morning. And we shall be hearing from Dr. Keto Swan. Thank you. Dr. Keto Swan is a Bermudan historian, and if all goes well, we're slated to start at 10 a.m. in the morning. So thank you again, everyone, for your contribution.